Okay, 6:30 on the dot. Thank you very much for joining us tonight here at the Deer Run Public Library. We're talking virtually with author Adam Higginbotham, author of a wonderful new book, Challenger, A True Story of Heroism and Disaster on the Edge of Space. The format for tonight is as follows. We'll talk for maybe like 45 minutes, Mr. Higginbotham and I, and then we'll take questions from both online and in the audience here at the library for about 10 minutes or so. Just a couple of quick announcements. We've got one more talk tomorrow scheduled. Will Cockrell, author of Everest Incorporated, the renegades and rogues who built an industry at the top of the world. If you're interested in mountain climbing, please, it's a great book. Please join us tomorrow night at 6:30. And I would also encourage Deer Run Library members. We got our summer reading program, adult and children. Please want to encourage everyone to take part and join us in our program. We have a lot of great prizes. The theme of this year's program is adventure. So make sure information is on our website, dearbornlibrary.org. So want to introduce Mr. Higginbotham. He's the author of Midnight in Chernobyl, winner of the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction and the Colby Award for Military and Intelligence History. It's one of the New York Times 10 best books of 2019 and became an international bestseller. Mr. Higginbotham's narrative nonfiction and feature writing has appeared in magazines including the New Yorker, Wired, Smithsonian, and the New York Times Magazine. So please welcome Mr. Adam Higginbotham.
Thank you.
So tonight, as I mentioned, the theme of this year's summer reading program is adventure. And I made the connection with your book, Adam, that astronaut spaceflight and the astronauts, particularly on the Challenger, went on an adventure. And unfortunately, adventures sometimes don't end the way you expect them to. So I figure the best way we can talk about it is to talk about the astronauts and talk about what happened and what went wrong. What did you have? What were your reasons in writing this book? What made you want to write this book?
Well, I'd been fascinated by the space program when I was a kid. I was born in 1968, so I was 13 months old when Armstrong and Aldrin landed on the moon. My mother tells me that she did, or she used to tell me that she got me up in the middle of the night to witness it, although obviously I don't remember it. So, you know, the space shuttle program was really my part of the space program, because I was 12, I think, when the first one launched in 1981. And I really clearly remember where I was and how I found out about the Challenger accident. And it was in my mind when it came time to start thinking about what I could write about after the Chernobyl book, because I'd frequently been asked when I was promoting the Chernobyl book whether I remembered where I was when the Chernobyl accident happened. And I always had to admit that I didn't. I got no memory of it at all. But I did remember Challenger, which had happened almost exactly 3 months earlier in 1986. So I was sort of, for those reasons, I was kind of primed to be thinking about it. But then when I began looking into what I remembered about the story and what else had been written about it, I realized that there was a way in which it was popularly understood, which focused largely on the story of Krista McAuliffe, the teacher in space. And I realized that in the intervening 30 years, the stories of the other 6 members of the crew had largely been lost and neglected. So I wanted to first of all, I wanted to tell a story which charted their lives in the years before the accident, how they came to NASA, how they came to the launch pad that day in January 1986, what kind of people they were. So you, as a reader, you could really understand, what was lost in that personal context. But also, I felt that the Challenger accident, and to a lesser extent, the Columbia accident in 2003, really overshadowed the way the shuttle program was remembered in the popular imagination. So it seemed, kind of overshadowed by disaster and seemed like a failure. And what I realized when I went back to think about how I'd seen it at the time before Challenger and the way it was reported, there were 5 years of astonishing feats and achievements and really kind of ambitious and audacious missions that took place as part of the shuttle program. And people don't really remember that. And again, this was something that I felt, this was what was lost when Challenger happened. And that was one of the costs of it, is that those achievements have been kind of forgotten. And also it's hard to appreciate if you weren't around at the time. There's a whole generation of readers who weren't even born when the Challenger accident happened. It's hard to understand unless you know all of that context, exactly how shattering an experience for not just for the families of the crew and the people who worked at NASA, but for the nation, the Challenger accident was. So I really wanted to be able to write about it in that broader context and show, what it really meant at the time.
Yeah, I for people of a certain age, you remember it. I mean, I was in working in the University of Michigan undergraduate library, and I was putting as a shelver, and I was putting books together on a cart to shelve books back on the main floor, and I heard it on the radio, and it always made a mark in my mind, for lack of a better phrase.
Right.
I remembered. Now, were people willing to talk to you about the disaster?
Oh yes, yeah. I can't remember exactly how many people I interviewed now, but probably more than 60. I interviewed everyone from former administrators, from former heads of the agency of NASA, down to individual friends and family members of the crew, Navy divers who worked on the recovery effort to bring up the wreckage of Challenger from the bottom of the ocean, and individual engineers who glued tiles on the fuselage of Columbia when it was being constructed.
Were you the people who worked at NASA, were they reluctant to talk to you, like they were going to revealing trade secrets or revealing problems that why it may have happened or why they could have NASA blamed?
No, I think to the contrary. I think that the people who worked there at the time, and this was one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book now. After all this time has passed, people who worked at NASA at the time who would have been unwilling or reluctant to talk in the immediate aftermath of the accident, have long since retired and are much more prepared to be open and frank about what things were like at the time. And that was what I found when I talked to them. And on the other hand, a lot of these people are now reaching into their 70s, 80s, and in some cases their 90s. So this really represented a sort of final opportunity to kind of capture some of those memories before it just passed into history.
Now you start the first thing in the book is the Apollo 1 disaster, the fire.
Mm-hmm.
You're very frank and very descriptive about how like it wasn't. Why did you start? I guess I should say, why did you start there?
Because there's a way in which NASA really experienced the same accident over and over again. Challenger is foreshadowed in many different ways by the Apollo 1 fire. People who worked at NASA at the time felt that they learned key and important lessons from why that fire happened. And many people who worked at NASA at the time, said in the months and years afterwards that they felt that they would never have got to the moon had the accident not happened, because they learned so many important lessons from the accident. But there's so many parallels between Apollo 1 and Challenger in terms of this notion of go fever, of pressing forward towards launching, even though there are problems. You hope that you're going to be able to sort them out on the hoof on the way to the launch pad, and then those problems resurface again with Columbia in 2003. So I wanted to construct the book in that fashion, so that it's bookended by, at the beginning, the Apollo 1 fire, and then at the end, Columbia. And in the center of the book, the heart of the book, is about Challenger.
They heard you mention in interviews before that NASA, before they even started putting men in space, commissioned a study by GE, and GE said to see, hey, what's the percentage? What would this percentage be in getting a man back from space safely? And they said, less than 5%.
Oh, that's the GE study about putting a man on the moon.
Man on the moon.
That's what they said. Yeah, they asked GE to do a probabilistic study of the chances of successfully landing men on the moon and then safely returning them to Earth, and they said it was less than 5%.
So I mean, space flight is dangerous, but it's sort of like it just got pushed to the side, I guess.
The danger, you mean?
Yeah.
I mean, and I think that's that is a continuous thread that runs through this story, is that what happened as NASA continually pressed forward with one audacious exploit after another, and they were successful despite several important setbacks and a few notable deaths. The gap between how hazardous the engineers who worked at NASA and the astronauts who were members of the astronaut office understood spaceflight to be, and how hazardous the public perceived it to be, gradually widened as the years went by. And that gap just kept increasing. The more successful and apparently routine spaceflight seemed to be to the public, the more misrepresentative that was. And that's partly why Challenger was such a shock.
Well, you continue to describe in the book this push-pull kind of. NASA was constantly underfunded, but they wanted to get the most government dollars that they could, and that involved doing like putting men on the moon, all these extravagant things, but it's very dangerous, and sometimes it doesn't work.
Right, and part of the tragedy was that the more frequently they did these things, the more the public became easily bored and jaded by the great spectacles that NASA was managed to stage. So that although the moonwalk executed by Aldrin and Armstrong in 1969, attracted a record global television audience, by the time the crew of Apollo 17 was walking on the moon in 1972, people were phoning into their local television stations to complain that Medical Center, a soap opera set in a hospital, had been temporarily suspended in broadcasting in favor of the unwelcome sight of two men walking on the moon, which is, you know, at this remove is almost impossible to believe, but that actually happened. That's how weary people became of watching this amazing spectacle.
Oh, I remember looking at the television guide, like how they would have things like the broadcast may be interrupted due to a moonwalk, and then gradually as time went by, just disappeared, wasn't in there anymore.
Right, right.
It's now, as a librarian, I'm always interested in stories of how you find information when you least expect it. Can you talk about your experience at the NASA archives?
I think the most, I mean, I did because I'm not sure whether I would tend to characterize it as good luck. But I guess there is another interpretation where it's just kind of, you know, being indefatigable and just persistent. But I had an episode when I was researching Midnight in Chernobyl where I just eventually, the director of the Chernobyl Museum, after I'd visited her for 2 or 3 separate occasions of over a period of months, and she'd been quite discouraging and suggested that the project I was working on was a waste of time and would never come to anything. And eventually, at the end of the 3rd meeting of like, you know, 3 hours of sitting there over tea and biscuits with my fixer and translator, she reached into a desk drawer and said, well, I think if you're serious about this, you might find this interesting. And it turned out to be an MVD, the Soviet police force, the original notes of the records of the local police force at the Chernobyl station that had been designated for destruction 20 years earlier and had been saved by the police officer who'd been told to destroy it. And this, you know, was like a continuous record for 2 weeks of everything that had happened immediately after the accident. And I had a similar thing with the Challenger book, which was that I went down to the National Air and Space Museum archives in Chantilly, Virginia, and I was only able to get in there 2 years after I'd begun research into the book because COVID had closed down all of the reading rooms in all of the federal archives. So I knew I wanted to go there, but they were closed. And when they reopened, there was such a backlog of researchers wanting to get in there that then you had to wait for an appointment. And I wanted to go down there because I was looking for some transcripts that a journalist named Joe Trento had made of his interviews with senior NASA staff, most of whom were long since dead by the time I started work on the book. And I'd called Joe at the beginning of the project and asked him if he'd had these transcripts. He said, oh, no, well, no, I don't, because I donated them all to the National Air and Space Museum. Otherwise I'd have let you have them. But if you go down there, you know, I'm sure they'll let you see them. And so I called them up and they said, well, yeah, you can absolutely come down and see them, but you're going to have to wait until we reopen. So I went down there, and then as it turned out, there really wasn't much to this stuff that Joe had filed away. It was just like a handful of sort of buff folders. And there was probably 2 hours worth of work in going through these transcripts. And I was down there for 2 days. So, and he donated 3 boxes of material to the archives. But I was, you know, after I'd gone through this stuff, and it took me probably half a day in total, I was bearing in mind Robert Caro's, you know, advice: turn every page, right?
Yeah.
So then I thought, well, I've got another day and a half here, so I just better make sure I go through everything. Who knows when I'll be back, right? I've got everything I think I need from here, but let's go through everything. So I started laboriously going through every single piece of paper in the rest of these 3 cardboard boxes that Joe and his wife Susan had donated. And then about halfway through the second day, I came across this padded envelope right at the end of one of the boxes, and it had an unlabeled CD in a plastic jewel case. And I thought, well, you know, this, I don't know how long this has been here, but it's probably at least 20 years old. And if there is anything recoverable on it at all, it's unlikely to be readable in any, you know, 21st century computer. But I took it to the archivist regardless, and I just said, look, Elizabeth, I just found this CD in the box. I don't know if there's anything on it at all, but you know, would you humor me and just like see if you could check it out and see if there's anything on it? And she said, sure. Why don't you go off to lunch? I'll give it to the IT guys, and we'll see if I can find anything on it. So I went off to the museum cafeteria. I got a sandwich. I came back 30 minutes later. And when I came back into the reading room, I said, Elizabeth, I suppose you had any luck with that CD. And she was like, oh, no, actually, we did. So go down to the computer at the end of the room and take a look at this. We managed to pull something off it. And I went over and sat down, and there was a Word document they'd managed to find that was on the CD. And it wasn't anything that I'd been looking for at all. It was 600 pages long. And it turned out to be a memoir that had been written by Roger Beaujolais, who was the leader of the rocket engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractors who had built the solid rockets that were the cause of the accident. And he'd written it and finished it in 1999, but never managed to get it published. So nobody had ever used it. And that told his whole story from the inside, right from the beginning of his career to the years after he left Morton Thiokol. And I knew when I embarked on the project that this guy Roger Beaujolais was needed to be a central protagonist in the book. But although he'd lectured and things after he left Thiokol, I still didn't really know very much about him or where he'd come from. And this was, you know, everything. And it was that enabled me to make him like a major protagonist in the book.
Yeah, I would like to talk about the conference the night before the launch a little bit in a couple of minutes, because that's very key. I wanted to compliment you on your writing. For lack of a better phrase, it was almost dreamlike writing. I mean, I wanted to, it's like, okay, I put it down for this or that, but I look forward to getting back to reading it because I enjoyed it so much.
Oh, really? Thank you.
And of course, in a situation like in a book about Challenger, there's a lot of technical things that you needed to explain in order for people to understand it. Did you have, and I found that I understood it. Did you have a process? Did you have a process that you went through in order to make it understandable?
Yeah, I certainly do, because I'm certainly no engineer and no scientist. You know, I used to say about the Chernobyl book that my middle school physics teacher would have been aghast to discover that I'd started to write a book that involved an explanation of nuclear fission, because I was such a hopeless physics student and I just couldn't grasp any of it. But in both cases, I had an enormous amount of help. You know, I had a pair of nuclear physicists at Princeton who helped me first understand and then write about the process of fission for that book. And with this book, I had the help of two of the rocket engineers who worked at Thiokol at the time of the accident and worked on the rockets in the years before Challenger, who looked over what I was writing and you know, saved me from a lot of egregious errors. But in terms of the process, it really has to start with me being able to understand it in order to write it in a way that I feel, you know, other people can understand. So that's the sort of, the process is basically I have to learn it and figure it out for myself. And only when I've done that can I actually put it on the page. Because I find that you know, sometimes you read history books that are written by non-scientists or non-engineers like myself, and you can tell that if it's not done properly, you know, people have just sort of regurgitated something they've been told by someone else without really understanding it. And then when you're reading it, it makes it quite hard for you to understand it. And if you don't, then it makes the story, it detracts from the story, because in something like Challenger or indeed Chernobyl, you know, what I want to be able to do for the reader is to take them along with the process of realization that's dawning on the engineers involved in the story. So it takes you into their process, their experience of the accident. And if you as a reader don't really grasp the elementary concepts behind the engineering, then that will have a lot less impact.
Yeah, it must have been hard to get it right, because you don't want to take away from the story, or like a roadblock, or like we'll pause here and then get back to the story.
Yes, exactly. So the trick that I'm always trying to pull off is to put in the absolute minimum amount of technical detail that's necessary to keep the story moving forward, and for the reader to understand what's going on at any given moment, and to kind of salt that through the narrative at the right places, so that, as I say, you know, it's occurring at the point when the engineers are learning the important information that counts toward the accident. So then you can have some kind of, you have a lot of foreshadowing, and therefore you, because you're in the shoes of the engineers involved, are experiencing the rising tension as you fear that something's going to happen.
Now, I want to also compliment you on your reporting. I mean, there is some details in the stories of the astronauts, life stories of the astronauts and the Challenger. I was like, whoa. And also stories details along the line, like it was cold here, or it was, I just, it was, wow, I was amazed by your reporting. Uh, did you, were the relatives of the astronauts, the living relatives, were they reluctant, or were they happy to talk to you?
No, they proved to be extremely receptive. And I think that's partly because enough time has passed that they're prepared to talk about it. But also, I think that the part of what I did is I didn't approach them until I'd done quite a lot of reporting, because I wanted to make sure that I understood their personal experience in the fullest context I could before I actually spoke to them. And also I sent them copies of Midnight in Chernobyl, because I felt that would show them the way in which I wanted to tell this story. I wanted to approach it in a similar way. And at the heart of that was this idea that I talked about before, which is that I want to show the stories of the astronauts and their lives in its fullest context, so that the reader can understand what's lost. You need to understand what happens in the years before the accident. So you're not really just telling a story of a catastrophe. You're telling a story of a group of people whose lives were destroyed or torn apart by the catastrophe. And I think only by understanding it in that context can you really appreciate what it meant.
Now, I like to think of myself as an empathic person, and when I do writing, I feel it. I draw on those feelings to really add details, and really make my writing as best as I can. Did you have a lot of trouble writing the last part of the book, where sadly the accident happens, after getting to know all these astronauts' families?
I did. I did find it quite difficult. For exactly that reason, that I you know, some of the families I learned enough about to really feel like that you know, what I was putting on the page was you know, revealing what I knew about them in a way that I mean, I'm not being very articulate about this, that I'd really come to know what they were like to be with as people. And so that I realized in retrospect that made me actually quite reluctant to begin work on those parts of the book dealing with the accident itself, because I wrote the book almost entirely in chronological order, and so I did push off the moment where I had to sit down and write those parts of the book because I didn't want to be responsible for their deaths. It was quite hard to do.
Now, let's get to the exact issue with Challenger. Now, the O-rings, it was, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm still not a little sure about their function. Now, they were supposed to guard against the fuel leak, and when the liftoff happened.
Yes, broadly speaking. So the O-rings were necessary because the solid rockets, which provided the majority of the thrust to carry the space shuttle on the first most demanding part of its journey into orbit, the first 2.5 minutes of flight. The two solid rockets strapped on the outside of the shuttle's external tank, they would fire for 2 minutes, 22 seconds, and then they would be jettisoned and they would parachute back to Earth to be reused again. Now, they were solid rockets, which meant that they were, in principle, little different from giant fireworks, like giant Roman candles, meaning that they were filled with solid fuel, which was this kind of rubbery compound, which was a combined fuel and oxidizer. And once lit on the launch pad, they couldn't be extinguished. They couldn't be controlled in any way once they were lit. They would just have to burn through. So they couldn't be jettisoned before that process was complete, because if they were, that would destroy the shuttle. And if something went wrong with them in those first 2 minutes and 22 seconds, then there was actually no escape from the shuttle, because it didn't have, unlike all previous NASA manned spacecraft, it did not have an escape mechanism that the astronauts could use to leave the spacecraft in that first phase of flight. Now, they were 150 feet long and 12 feet across, these boosters, so massive. And that meant that they couldn't be constructed as fully fueled rockets in a single piece. They had to be built in segments. And they were manufactured at Morton Thiokol's plant in Utah, and then they were transported in segments by rail all the way across the country from Utah to Florida, to Cape Canaveral. And then these segments would be fitted together inside the vehicle assembly building, stacked one on top of another. But the joints had to be gas tight, because once they were lit, there was a combustion chamber, which was just a sort of a giant cylindrical hole all the way down the length of the rockets. And that was what created the thrust. The jet of hot gas came out of the bottom end of the rocket, and that, you know, pushed the shuttle into space. But if any of that hot gas could leak out of any of the joints between the segments of the rocket, then it would not merely be a leak, but because it was burning at somewhere in excess of 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the jet of hot gas could cut through the shell of the rocket. And if it did that, it would cut into the fuel tank underneath, release pressurized oxygen and hydrogen into the atmosphere. It would catch light and the whole thing would be destroyed. So in order to make those seals as tight as possible, there was a tang and clevis joint, which is like the tongue and groove of a floorboard, two floorboards fitting together. And it was held together with 177 steel alloy pins, which were driven into the joint all around the circumference of the rocket to hold it together. But in order to make it as tight as possible, they put in these two rubber gaskets that were like the O-rings in a faucet or in a carburetor in a car engine, except much larger. So they were 37 feet in diameter, but only a quarter of an inch thick. So they were both enormous and extremely delicate. And the tolerances within the rocket casing were so fine, as thick as the sheet, as a couple of sheets of copy paper, that it meant that if there was any contamination in the joint around the O-ring, anything like a piece of lint or a human hair, that could cause a leak. So you can see that even the slightest amount of damage to one of these rings could prove catastrophic.
Well, I was very surprised about how Roger Beaujolais, because he was doing the review after every shuttle launch, he mentioned, hey, there's a problem with the soot and smoke going through. The O-rings weren't working too well, and the NASA, everybody was like, yeah, okay, we'll fix it, or
Right.
they accepted it. They accepted it out of the norm, out of their norms. They normalized it.
Yes, but to be fair, they didn't just brush it off. It's not as if someone like Beaujolais reported anomalies, as they would call them in their kind of bloodless language, with the O-rings, and then, you know, senior engineers would just say, oh, never mind, I'm sure it'll be fine. You know, they did conduct extensive tests, computer studies. You know, they were extremely rigorous about the sorts of tests that they conducted, or they thought they were. And as a result, they thought that they understood that the faults that they were detecting were within the realms of acceptable risk, meaning that they thought the likelihood of a catastrophic fault developing were vanishingly remote. And only after they satisfied themselves that that was the case did they say, I don't think we need to worry about it. Now, the problem is that they did that over and over and over again. And as you say, in almost every case, they gradually expanded what they understood to be and they regarded as acceptable risk. And that's the source of the problem.
No, they were going to launch Challenger on a Sunday, and that got scrubbed. And then they were going to, they had an open, they were thinking about Monday, and they were kind of missed a perfect launch window.
Yeah.
And then so they put it off to Tuesday, but then they had the horrible cold or frost, the second 100-year frost in the year.
Yeah.
But the Monday night, there was this meeting between the Morton Thiokol people, the people at the Marshall Space Center, and the people at NASA, saying, "Hey, do we want to go ahead?" Is this Morton Thiokol people are like, "Guys, it's a problem," and it just was very interesting and very human. The results of that meeting, how they came to the decision that they did.
Yeah, I mean that meeting for me, and learning about exactly what happened in that meeting was a pivotal point in the research, because it's you know, there are ways in which Challenger has become a sort of standby of anthropological or sociological analyses of how big organizations make bad decisions, and a frequent takeaway, to use the sort of the argot of those analyses, is that, you know, it was about communication breakdown and a failure of bureaucracy. And the frequent implication I find in those in those studies, those sort of management studies of the Challenger accident, in which you're supposed to extract, lessons to be used in office buildings up and down the country.
Yeah.
Is that it was a failing of bureaucracy, and that no individual was really at fault. But when I started going into these interview transcripts that had been left behind by the investigators for the Rogers Commission, who were charged with finding out what went wrong and making sure it never happened again after the accident, a very different story emerged, which was that these handful of investigators who were FBI agents and NTSB investigators went around and they interviewed. There were 34 men in that meeting in 3 different locations, and the investigators interviewed every one of them at least once in some detail. And what I found was, as you say, that this was a kind of extraordinary drama of human frailty, in which individuals and individual frailties and foibles played a very significant part. And ultimately it came down to one man at Morton Thiokol, who was the head of engineering, this guy Bob Lund, who was the 4th of the 4 senior managers in the room that night, who had to be unanimous in their decision to reverse what was originally a recommendation not to launch that they gave NASA. They gave NASA printed documents that said that they did not recommend going ahead with the launch. And NASA pushed back against this so hard that they went offline in this teleconference they had and said that they wanted to talk about it amongst themselves for a bit. And then in this caucus that they had, these 4 senior managers chose to ignore the recommendations of their own engineers, including Roger Beaujolais, and vote to flip from a no-go recommendation to a go for launch. And this all came down to this one guy, Bob Lund. The 3 other managers had already said that they would recommend the launch. And the way that it's described by a lot of the other guys who were in the room at the time, it was clear that Bob Lund thought this was a terrible idea, and that he really didn't want to reverse himself, and he really knew the risks involved. But a lot of them knew that Lund, who was an extremely collegiate, well-liked and capable engineer, had one outstanding fault, which was that he found it very hard to stand up to pressure from his senior managers. And so there's this terrible moment that's described by the other guys who are in the room, where Lund, looks in desperation down the table at his colleagues for some support. He doesn't want to change his mind. And, he tries to get up out of his chair. He wipes a hand across his face. He mutters to himself. And in the end, he just throws up his hands and says, "Okay, I agree, let's fire." And from that point onwards, there's really no turning back.
Now, the recovery mission of the debris of the Challenger was quite extensive, and you go into that. I was and how divers are used, how many personnel was used, how many miles of ocean and techniques they used to cover every inch, but sadly, were there any evidence that the astronauts were they alive when the explosion? Were they killed by the explosion? I guess the best way to put it.
They almost certainly were not killed by the explosion. The accident investigators and the doctors who examined the physical evidence recovered from the ocean of the crew compartment and of the bodies of the astronauts, the remains of the astronauts, indicated that the forces bearing on the shuttle orbiter, which tore it apart as the orbiter and the rockets and the external tank were torn apart by aerodynamic forces as the fuel caught fire and the rockets tore away and went off in separate directions. Those forces were not such that they would have caused the astronauts sufficient trauma to have killed them as that happened. And moreover, they discovered that the crew compartment, which was a separate pressurized and self-contained unit within the fuselage of the shuttle, broke away from the rest of the fuselage completely intact. And they discovered evidence from within the cockpit of the way equipment had been used during flight that seemed to indicate that at least one member of the crew was conscious and doing things in the cabin after the breakup. And so there was enough evidence to suggest that all the crew were almost certainly alive after the breakup, right up until the point when it made impact with the ocean about 2.5 minutes after the breakup. But at least one of them was probably conscious.
Now, obviously the most famous astronaut on this trip was Krista McAuliffe, the teacher in space. And do you think it resonated because she was a teacher, because she was a ordinary citizen? Was it that people feel like they could relate to her more and feel the tragedy, I guess, or it was even more so of a tragic event?
I think definitely. I mean, not only was McAuliffe extremely charismatic and smart and a fantastic communicator, but there were ways in which she, as the everyman astronaut NASA always intended her to be, intended the teacher in space to be, that she carried with her the dreams of everyone, who hoped to one day go into space themselves. And so I think in that way, people felt that they could identify with her in a way that they didn't identify with these, square-jawed supermen who had been the members of the astronaut corps in the 60s, the men that went to the moon. And so I think that, she did seem like someone that people could identify with in all sorts of different ways. And I think that's what, lent the tragedy partly what lent it such resonance. But also, it was, McAuliffe aside, it was also the most diverse crew in NASA history. There were 2 women, because McAuliffe was also accompanied by Judy Resnick, who was on her 2nd mission into space. But Ellison Onizuka was on the crew, the first Asian American in space. There was Ron McNair, who was the first African American, the 2nd African American in space. So, the crew really did represent a kind of idealized cross-section of society. So I think there were all sorts of ways in which, back in 1986, it seemed a particularly resonant tragedy. And that's another reason it was such a kind of a shattering experience for people, I think.
A couple more questions. Well, what surprised you the most about in your efforts to write the book?
There were a lot of surprises. I think that one of the biggest was actually in my research, because I mean, one of the things that made the research a very interesting process was that I realized as I began working on it that the time of the accident was really a sort of high watermark for how well resourced and funded newspapers were in the United States. And because this very rapidly became the biggest news story in the world, hundreds, thousands of reporters from TV stations and newspapers ultimately descended on Cape Canaveral to report out the story from every imaginable viewpoint. And so I assumed when I discovered this and I began digging into this sort of vast archive of material that you could read from contemporaneous sources, that one of the big newspapers, the Washington Post or the New York Times, would at some point have devoted a crack team of reporters to a multi-part series examining the inside story of the Rogers Commission and how they went about their work, what the political infighting was, the complex personalities involved. This is a panel that included, on one hand, Neil Armstrong, and on the other Richard Feynman. You know, so the kind of the stereotypical straight arrow American hero, test pilot, first man to walk on the moon. On the other hand, you know, this iconoclastic physicist who worked on the atom bomb program, was famous for doing crazy stuff, and by that time was a best-selling author. But when I got to that point in the research, I discovered that actually nobody had ever done that. There was no convenient inside story 6-part Washington Post series. So first thing I had to do was I went through the New York Times day by day and built a day-by-day timeline of the progress of the Rogers Commission. And then I spoke to Alton Keel, who was William Rogers died years ago, the head of the commission, but Alton Keel had been at his right hand almost from the beginning. And so I talked to him at great length, and also found a number of other interesting sources that then, you know, revealed that there was this kind of fascinating and quite dramatic story of what happened inside the commission, and how William Rogers began to suspect and then discover that senior NASA officials were not being completely honest with him about what had led up to the accident. And all of that stuff I just found astonishing.
Yeah, briefly, the Rogers Commission was put together to investigate the accident. And yeah, there was, like to talk to you more, but on especially about Rogers Commission and how Al McDonald really he a lot of guts in his testimony, but getting close to the hour. So is there anything else we didn't talk about that you would like to highlight?
I don't think there's anything. I think you've covered it, I think, from almost from beginning to end.
Oh, thank you. I tried to
No.
That's my aim.
No, those are fascinating questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so let's move on to the Q&A. Anybody here in the audience have a question? Yes, sir.
The O-ring problem, was that a sustaining problem, or did they just cover it up?
Well, by sustaining, did it happen a lot?
A lot, but were there signals that the O-rings are bad?
Yeah, he's talking about, he was asking about the O-rings, how they, obviously there were a lot of, it happened a lot on a number of flights.
Yes, and there were some very narrow escapes on previous flights. There was a previous flight where the O-rings came within fractions of a second of burning through on a previous flight. So the engineers definitely, the rockets were sending signals to the engineers that they were not correctly interpreting for many years before the accident happened.
Thank you.
All right, let's take a look online. What mistakes were repeated with Columbia?
Yes, the exactly the same pattern of junior engineers and middle-ranking engineers warning of catastrophe and being overruled is exactly what happened with Columbia. In a way, under even more even more devastating circumstances, because in that case, Columbia was in orbit for a week after the damage that ultimately proved fatal had been caused. And during that week, these engineers were sending repeated messages to their superiors, trying to get them to address the problem, and they were ignored or overruled.
Right. Let's check another. Let's see. A comment about how person in the virtual audience was at Disney World that day, and how the news spread, and it was became very somber. Let's see. You got, yeah, Guy?
There was an amazing contingent of educators and students watching this event around the United States. You discussed in the book how the community of educators went on with discussing what happened in front of their kids.
Yeah, you've mentioned the question is about the students that looked, students all over the country.
Yeah, I think at
were-
least 2.5 million students were watching in real time.
Did you come across any, like, how teachers dealt with it? Like any, I guess that's what the gentleman's question was, that he.
I
how-
didn't really, because that was, I mean, I think you could write an entire book just about that. I spoke to the one teacher I did speak to about her experience was Barbara Morgan, who was Krista McAuliffe's immediate backup. She was an elementary school teacher from Idaho, and she trained alongside McAuliffe, and she would have been the one who would have stepped in if McAuliffe had, you know, come down with a cold or something the day before launch. So she knew Krista McAuliffe extremely well and went through everything that she went through up to the point of launch with her. And so I did talk to Barbara about her experience, and she ultimately went on to become a fully qualified astronaut and to fly into space later.
Yeah, yeah. Let's see, one more, try to get one more here. The Starlink launch that was launched today, the Boeing Starliner, I believe it was.
Yeah.
Now, is it, in talking with people, did you, I know you talked to a lot of previous employees, previous workers at NASA. Did you get a sense of what things are like now at NASA?
Well, the one person who is most concerned with this issue that I did speak to at some length is a guy named Mike Cinelli, who runs this scheme within NASA that was founded after the Columbia accident, because the accident investigation board that was convened to investigate what happened to Columbia, their principal finding really was that NASA had not learned any of the lessons of Challenger, and those lessons that had been learned in the immediate wake of what happened in 1986 had been forgotten by 2003. So NASA set up this initiative that is called the Apollo Challenger Columbia Lessons Learned program, and it's run by Mike. And the function of that is to make sure that these lessons are kept fresh in the minds of everyone, not only everyone who works at NASA and within all of the contractor organizations, but at businesses and other large organizations around America. He goes around and talks to people about the wide lessons that can be learned from all of these three significant accidents. And so I did talk to him about it. And one of the most interesting things that he said about how NASA is different was that he said that, one of the principal things he tries to tell people is that it's easy in retrospect to look at what happened, especially with Challenger, and to imagine that, these guys in the room who had go fever, or who pushed through the launch of Challenger and put pressure on engineers and managers to change their minds, to change their recommendation from no-go to go, that these guys were like obviously malevolent or evil, and stood out from these groups of engineers as being, people are obviously making bad decisions. And Mike said that, the most important lesson you can take away is that's not how it works in real life. And that the people who are forcing through those decisions are people that you respect and like, and they're people that you've worked with for years. And so you really have to study people's behavior and their decision making very carefully in those kinds of meetings to avoid this kind of thing happening in the future. There aren't going to be necessarily obvious red flags where somebody is, wearing a stovepipe hat and twirling their moustache and appearing in a puff of evil. They're just going to be people that you know and respect. And so everybody really has to be on the alert for people who are going to overlook anomalies in order to prevent accidents like this happening in the future.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Adam. Thank you for your time, and it was a great book, a wonderful book. I would
Thank you.
encourage everyone to buy it, and we have copies here outside of the auditorium for purchase. So thank you very much for your time, and have a good night.
Not at all. And you. Thank you for having me. Good night.